This is Unit 13, Section B. Our first case is State v. Hoselton, or the case of the lookout. The defendant here was a hapless kid. He was stuck in a personally difficult set of circumstances. We've seen this before. He finds himself out with his pals, his Confederates. Unbeknownst to him, they break and enter a storage facility on a docked barge, and they begin to steal things. When he sees what's happening, he goes back to the car, which certainly could make him look like a lookout. He was eventually accused of and convicted of entering without breaking, as charged in the indictment. And the only evidence used to link him to the crime was his voluntary statement. In both his voluntary statement to the police and during his testimony at trial, he said that he had no idea what his pals were going to do, that they were going to commit a theft. And he did say that when he saw them removing the goods, he did return to the car. He never received any of the stolen property, which was later retrieved by the police from the other defendants, which certainly goes to credibility in this case. When asked if he was the lookout, he said, "You could say that." But remember our first word exercise and the caveat of reading testimony on the printed page for any appellate court without hearing the emphasis on those words. That statement is not dispositive. He could have said, "You can say that," or "You can say that," or "You can say that," or "You can say that," all of which mean something different. There are nuances of difference there, certainly, between some of these various points of reference, but there are differences. Now, in accomplice liability, we see our familiar dual intents again. Of course, with conspiracy, we have an intent to agree with an intent that the target crime be committed. Both of those intents are required. And we also have dual intents here in accomplice liability. I'm sure you remember our friend Mr. Laurier. He keeps popping up. He beat the conspiracy charge back in one of our earlier visits because there was knowledge present but not the requisite intent that the target crime be completed. Knowledge alone was not enough for conspiracy, and knowledge alone is usually not enough for accomplice liability. Riley v. State shows that accomplice liability can exist for reckless crimes, while the evidence here could not show who fired the wounding shots. The defendant here fired shots, and he was found guilty as an accomplice for both assaults, which exposed him to the same punishment he would have faced as the shooter. Here's the holding. Both the defendant and Portala acted with a reckless disregard for human life, even though only one could have committed the first-degree assault. Since both had the culpable mental state, both may be convicted of the crime. It's sort of a res ipsa loquitur argument that you probably came across in torts. Again, we look at the common law principle of accomplice liability. Although an accomplice must have the specific intent to aid and abet the commission of a criminal act, it is not necessary that he intend or know of the precise consequences of that act. The defendant is liable for all the reasonably foreseeable consequences of the criminal act he intended to aid. Many courts, many jurisdictions still embrace the foreseeable consequences doctrine. The MPC rejects it. Under the MPC, an accomplice may only be liable for acts that he purposefully undertakes. In State v. VT, we take a look at accomplice liability actus reus. Here we learn that merely being present without active participation at the scene and being friends with a criminal does not mean accomplice liability has been established. Just knowing about a crime or being present at the time is not sufficient to make one an accomplice per Lauria. But still, there's a cautionary note here. This kid got in a lot of trouble because he wasn't careful who he was hanging out with. Wilcox shows us how trivial the assistance can be and still expose someone to accomplice liability. Herbert Wilcox owned a magazine in England. He was a big jazz buff. He was charged with aiding and abetting Coleman Hawkins, one of the greatest saxophone players of all time, in violating the provisions of the Aliens Order of 1920 by failing to comply with the condition that Hawkins shall take no employment, paid or unpaid, while in the United Kingdom, and shall not land in the country without the leave of an immigration officer. Hawkins was a celebrated saxophone player, and he was invited to the United Kingdom to perform, even though official permission was not granted. The question becomes, can Wilcox be convicted of aiding and abetting an offense committed by Hawkins, an individual that Wilcox had never met until he arrived at the airport in England? And the answer is yes. And the court found the following evidence of assistance, which again shows you how slight it can be. Wilcox came to the airport to report on the arrival of Hawkins for his magazine. And it showed the important effect that Hawkins' arrival had for the jazz industry as well as for the magazine, because Hawkins' arrival was so newsworthy that Wilcox could report on it and sell more copies of his magazine in anticipation of the concert. Wilcox paid to be present at the concert, and he provided verbal encouragement at the concert. He applauded, he cheered, he supported the fact that, in support of the fact that Wilcox was aiding and abetting Hawkins to play illegally. Now, this provision was really a labor regulation in post-World War II England. The purpose of it was to protect the unemployed. There were plenty of unemployed saxophone players in England after the war, and this act had been passed a couple of decades previously to address a similar shortage of work for people in the various trades. Now, if Wilcox was convicted for cheering and encouraging and for taking an interest in the outcome of the jazz performance by Coleman Hawkins, you have to ask yourself this in terms of accomplice liability. If you're at a hockey game and a fight breaks out between two players, are you an accomplice to the assault if you cheer on your team's player in the fight? If you're at a boxing match screaming, kill him, as your favorite boxer pummels his opponent, are you an accomplice if he in fact kills him? Did you have the intent to assist through encouragement and the intent that the actor actually kill his opponent, assuming that you were caught up in the bloodlust or even the passione of the moment?